This is the final episode in our latest season featuring missing persons, unsolved homicides, and unresolved deaths across the United States. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are solely the interviewee's own. All individuals are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. This series discusses crime scenes in detail and violence. Listener discretion is advised. This is The Fall Line. The disappearance of Mary Shotwell Little is one of Atlanta's most enduring mysteries. But for a long time, I didn't know that. Growing up here, her missing persons case was not one that I saw covered in the media. Of course, I wasn't looking for that coverage either. Atlanta has a lot of cold cases, and I honestly couldn't give you a definite number because there are people I know are not listed on some of the departmental websites across the metro. It's a fragmented system, though there are officials working to change that. Many victims are difficult to find in any archive because their unsolved disappearances or homicides have little or no media presence, now or in the time when they went missing or were killed. In our experience, chancing upon an old flyer or a single line on a police blotter is sometimes the difference between a case remaining in obscurity or re-entering the public consciousness. For other cases, it's more that younger generations aren't aware of events that once gripped Atlanta. That seems to be the case in the disappearance of Mary Shotwell Little and another, possibly related case, the murder of Diane Shields. Both women worked at the same bank here in Atlanta in the mid-1960s. The connection between Mary and Diane, it may go beyond that shared position. When Mary vanished, her desk at Citizens and Southern Bank, it sat empty for weeks. Then, Diane Shields, a 22-year-old secretary from Alabama, was hired to fill that exact position. She sat at Mary's desk, she used Mary's phone, and she worked with some of the same colleagues who had watched Mary's case unfold. A year and a half later, Diane also disappeared, but she was found, murdered, in the East Point area of Metro Atlanta. Since then, authorities have worked to discover whether there is a link between these unsolved cases. When I started listening to podcasts, I realized that Mary Shotwell Little's case had been a major story in the city at the time of her disappearance, in October of 1965, and that the search for her had been intense. APD followed dozens of leads and tips to supposed clandestine graves that turned up no signs of the missing woman. The FBI was involved, and they got involved quickly. All of that became apparent when I heard Jessica Knoll's deep dive podcast, 5 Roses. At the time of its release, Knoll was an investigative reporter with 11 Alive, and her 2018 episodes and articles were my introduction to a story of not just one cold case, but 2. I learned that Mary, a 25-year-old secretary, disappeared from Lenox Square shopping center, and that she was not the only person from her place of employment to do so. According to Knoll's reporting, before her disappearance, Mary received mysterious roses from an unknown sender and strange phone calls at work, ones that disturbed her. She became increasingly paranoid and told coworkers that she had, quote, something important to tell them, though she never revealed what it was before vanishing on October 14th, 1965. Jessica Knoll also reported on the murder of Diane Shields. The cases show what some consider to be evidence of connection. They shared a place of employment, and their personal cars were involved in their disappearance or deaths. Though Diane had never met Mary, she was aware of what had happened to her. And both Mary's disappearance and Diane's murder remain cold cases to this day. But Mary's case seems to have attracted more attention back in 1965. And perhaps that's because of the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. According to the Doe Network, in October of '65, Mary was a newlywed, and, as we said, working as a secretary at C&S Bank. She and her husband, Roy H. Little Jr., he worked as a bank examiner, had been married, quote, for only 6 weeks at that time. Per the DeKalb History Center, she left work on October 14th, and she stopped for groceries and then dropped them off in her car. Then she decided to eat dinner with a coworker. They met at the S&S Cafeteria, a Southern-style meat-and-three casual dining establishment. She wouldn't have had dinner plans with her husband Roy that night because he was out of town. Afterward, Mary and her coworker strolled Lenox Square Mall, and then they said their goodbyes. Mary's coworker said that they parted ways at about 8 p.m. that night, and Mary had parked her car, a Mercury Comet, at the mall's lot. The next morning, when Mary failed to show up for work, the bank became concerned. The History Center wrote that officials, quote, reached out to authorities. And we don't know the full scope of the Atlanta police's search that day, but we do know that they returned to the parking lot at the mall. And there, they discovered Mary's car. But according to mall security, it had not been there all night or in the early morning, not when they did their rounds. And quote, authorities also noticed about 40 miles on the odometer that were unaccounted for. According to the Charlie Project, police found, quote, blood in several places, on the driver's door near the handle, on the inside window of the passenger side, smeared over the vinyl of the front seats. They also discovered women's undergarments that had been, quote, carefully rolled together and placed between the seats, and, quote, a black brassiere and a section of stocking that had been cut neatly as if by a knife. The groceries she'd bought on October 14th were still inside the vehicle. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution reported that thousands of people joined what would become, quote, the largest search Atlanta had ever seen. Based on our discussion with the current civilian investigative team, Mary's husband Roy was extensively questioned too. Her former roommates and her coworkers were also interrogated. But despite the efforts of both Atlanta police and the FBI, Mary was never found. However, there were leads. About a month after her disappearance, there was a possible break in the case. Per the Charlotte Observer, investigators traced use of Mary's credit cards to several gas purchases in North Carolina on October 15th, the day after she vanished. The purchases occurred first in Charlotte, Mary's hometown where her family lived, and then later the same day in Raleigh, about 150 miles away. Investigators matched the signatures on the receipts to her handwriting. And according to the Doe Network, quote, the gas station attendant in Charlotte recalled seeing a woman with a cut on her head, trying to hide her face, traveling in the company of a man who seemed to be giving her orders. In Raleigh, the attendant told of a, quote, bloody woman, with blood even on her legs, traveling with 2 men. It was a promising lead, but it did not take investigators to Mary. According to the civilian investigators that we interviewed for this episode, it was never proven that the woman seen in North Carolina was Mary, or that she was the person who signed the credit card receipts. But her card was used. They tell us that this created 2 theories. One, that Mary was abducted and killed in the Atlanta area, and that her body was buried somewhere in the city, and that her own car was used to help commit that crime. The second theory was that Mary was driven to a more remote location in the metro Atlanta area in her own car, attacked, and then an exchange was made. A second perpetrator then returned Mary's car to the Lenox Mall parking lot, and Mary was forcibly taken to North Carolina, which explained the sightings that later occurred. The North Carolina gas station sightings raised crucial questions that would influence investigations for decades. If Mary was indeed taken across state lines, it meant that her disappearance wasn't just a local Atlanta crime. It was potentially an interstate kidnapping. And if she was murdered in North Carolina, as some of the evidence suggested, then any search for her remains might need to focus there, not in the Atlanta area, where most efforts had concentrated over the years. Diane Shields' death was another shock to Metro Atlanta, both as a brutal crime in its own right and in its possible connection to Mary's disappearance. Per the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Diane, a 22-year-old from Alabama, had taken over Mary's position at C&S Bank. As we said, they even worked the same desk, and they had some of the same friends. From what we've been told, Diane was reportedly interested in Mary's case, and there were rumors that she'd been speaking with or even working with police. And then, Diane disappeared too. But unlike Mary, her body was recovered. According to Jessica Knoll, Diane was found murdered in the trunk of her car on May 19, 1967. Like Mary, Diane had received roses at work. And Diane's childhood friend also said that, quote, she started receiving strange telephone calls, and she went to the police station about it. Some in law enforcement have long believed the two cases are connected, which makes sense considering the circumstances. But no concrete answers have ever come for the families of Mary Shotwell Little or Diane Shields. Our show normally covers cases that have received little or no media attention. But we're also based in Atlanta, and we track what happens here, like the progression of a decades-old cold case, like Mary's or like Diane's. And earlier this year, a retired police lieutenant, who we have consulted many times over the years, reached out with intriguing news. A team of investigators had spent the last decade systematically re-examining every aspect of Mary Shotwell Little's disappearance, using modern analytical methods, and their work has led them to reconsider some previously dismissed leads and to explore new theories about what happened to both Mary and to Diane. Our friend thought that we might want to discuss their upcoming project. One of the main participants, John Fedak, was a former DeKalb County police officer, and he's a local private investigator here in Atlanta. The chance to bring Atlanta cold cases to public attention is something that we're always interested in doing, particularly when investigators feel that they've uncovered information that could potentially help resolve a case. So, today, we're speaking with two members of that team, John Fedak and Steve Kendrick, whose documentary on the case is releasing in the fall of 2025. They're both Atlanta natives and thus long familiar with Mary Shotwell Little's case. Or they thought they were. But, they say, working on their investigation and documentary has made them question much of what they thought they understood about her disappearance and the murder of Diane Shields. Growing up in Metro Atlanta, John was exposed to the case from an early age through periodic media coverage that kept the story alive in the public consciousness. His connection to the case deepened during his police career when he worked alongside the son of Jack Perry, the Atlanta homicide commander who originally investigated Mary's disappearance. After transitioning from law enforcement to a 25-year career in technology and private investigation, John eventually moved into documentary filmmaking. His renewed interest in the Mary Shotwell Little case was sparked when he realized that the 50th anniversary of her disappearance had passed in 2015 with virtually no media attention, a stark contrast to the regular coverage the case had received over the decades. And that surprising silence motivated him to see what he could do to help resolve her case. Recognizing that he needed expertise beyond his own background, John assembled a team of 8 professionals to analyze Mary's disappearance. The group included retired homicide detectives, attorneys, a profiling expert, Atlanta Journal-Constitution reporters, and technical crime scene specialists. After losing 2 of their members to COVID-19, the remaining 6-person team was left grieving. But they continued their collaborative efforts, and now are presenting their current findings in a new documentary, The Vanishing, the 60-year unsolved disappearance of Mary Shotwell Little. They're hoping it will generate the kind of attention that could finally bring forward new witnesses or overlooked documents that may solve these mysteries once and for all. We sat down with John and Steve Kendrick, John's longtime friend and producer of the documentary, to discuss their process and what they hoped their investigation might do for both cases. First, I asked John to tell me more about the team he assembled to analyze the Mary Shotwell Little disappearance, which is where they began their work. Early on, John said, he was able to verify that the case evidence in both Mary and Diane Shields' cases had been disposed of or destroyed. So, to assemble a team, he would be starting without the assumption that those items could eventually be tested.
In the sense of physical evidence, it's gone. It was simply a 45-year-old, a 50-year-old case. It was old. It was dusty. What did they do? They took clothing. They took photographs. They took a lot of stuff and dropped it in a dumpster. What we could have done with that now, we possibly could have solved it in 2 weeks. It's gone. It was not late at night and it was conspiracy. That's not the case. It was just simply a matter of this regime saying, this stuff is old, get rid of it. I went out and found cops, attorneys, college professors, people to help me. There were 8 of us at one point, meeting regularly, talking, trying to pull together information, not to solve it. We weren't arrogant enough to think that we can solve this, but we can hopefully turn the light on it, get the FBI to reopen it, get APD to reopen it, get Fulton County DA to reopen it. That was my goal. And that's still my goal after 10 years, to get a formal law enforcement agency with subpoena powers to open it up, and I'll shut up and get out of their way and give them everything I've got and let them take over. I was a good detective. I was a good cop. Got a lot of commendations, but working with those people for 5-7 years, it's still going on. It was absolutely astounding. And they all had a curiosity. Why? And the simple question is, why hasn't this, at 50 years at that point, 55 years, why hasn't the case been solved? And that was, as much as anything, why everybody kept digging.
Your documentary takes an investigative approach rather than an approach just based on entertainment. That's something I've really seen you outline in some of the material that's been provided. Can you walk me through the specific structure of the film and how you decide to present the evidence to viewers?
We wanted to make sure that the audience that eventually saw the film understood that we wanted to not make this just about a movie, but we wanted to make sure that the audience followed it as an investigative analysis on how Mary was treated in the beginning as far as the investigation went.
Can you talk about any previously unseen material or perhaps evidence that's come to light that the documentary has been able to reveal and that audiences are going to learn about for the first time, and how you're able to present these findings?
I can give 1 or 2 real quick examples. One is the film talks about Jim Ponder, special agent with the FBI. He was in charge of the investigation from the second day. His son has become a friend of ours and a great supporter of ours. He said he's seen these boxes in his dad's garage and his office for 40 years, 50 years, whatever. He brought the box to us, and there are original FBI reports. The paper clips are rusty. It's not copies of it, the original files that he worked on. He brought them home. We got to look through those. Some very good information, no smoking gun per se.
Some of that information referenced a confession that has come up time and time again in Mary's case.
Along the way, a convict named Larry Stargell, who was in prison in Reidsville, wrote a letter and said he has personal knowledge of the crime. And the short version is he lays out this 19-page document that he hand wrote in front of Jack Perry, the homicide commander, initialed it, wouldn't sign it, but in that thing he goes through Mary being grabbed, Mary being kidnapped, Mary being taken across state lines, Mary being kept, Mary being murdered, et cetera, et cetera. And I discounted that. Something came to light along the way that completely changed my opinion. Doesn't mean it's going to solve the case, but he mentions a Gerald Mason, and I did a lot of homework over the phone with cold case detectives and a LA prosecutor, and I think there is a very strong possibility that there's some truth to that 19-page document, which would be totally the reverse of what everybody's thought for the last 50 years.
Before the break, John mentioned 2 men, Larry Stargell and Gerald Jerry Mason. Over the years, their names have surfaced as possible persons of interest in Mary Shotwell Little's disappearance. Stargell was in prison by the time that Diane Shields was murdered, and to our knowledge, his name was not connected to her death. But the 2 men were associated via a prison confession by Stargell in a kidnapping and murder-for-hire plot involving Mary Shotwell Little. According to Jessica Knoll's investigative reporting, it was September of 1966 when Larry Stargell, an inmate serving a life sentence for murder at Reidsville State Prison in Georgia, asked to speak with authorities on Mary's case. We recommend that you listen to Knoll's podcast, 5 Roses, to get the full extent on that background. but her 11 Alive reporting on the subject gives a good overview. Per Knoll, during interviews with Lieutenant Jack Perry and later FBI agents, Stargell provided a detailed 19-page statement alleging that he had been present during Mary's kidnapping and murder by Gerald Jerry Mason and an unnamed accomplice. According to Stargell's account, the men were paid $5,000 each to kidnap Mary from Lenox Square on October 14, 1965, and to hold her captive at a house near Mount Holly, North Carolina, for several days. Stargell claimed that he witnessed Mary's murder in the back seat of a car as they prepared to transport her back to Atlanta, describing how one of the men stabbed her in the neck with a fishing knife. He also alleged that Mason showed him Mary's burial location near Atlanta Municipal Airport and her charge card, the one that she'd used at gas stations. Stargell claimed that the men were involved in a blackmail scheme using money stored in an airport baggage locker. Police did find disturbed ground at the airport. However, FBI investigation revealed that the unnamed accomplice Stargell accused was employed by Mount Holly's water department and had documented work hours during the time frame of the alleged crime, which placed him in North Carolina at the time Mary was rumored to have been there. Per CBS News, Gerald Mason had a lengthy criminal record of his own, including burglary, robbery, sexual assault, and the murder of 2 police officers in California. It took a long time for him to be caught and convicted for those California murders. In the meantime, he established himself as a successful business owner in South Carolina. He died in 2017, and he was never formally charged in relation to Mary Shotwell Little's disappearance or alleged death. 2 questions remain unanswered: why Stargell made this confession, and why his story kept changing when investigators questioned him further. When details shifted and some facts couldn't be verified, the lead simply didn't pan out. To our knowledge, the location of the physical confession, the papers that it was recorded on, is now unknown as well. So the descriptions of what it contained, as recounted in various reports, that's all that new investigators have to go on. John told us that when his team reviewed the historical record, they found the discrepancies were a big reason that many investigators may have discounted much of what Stargell had to say. But there were some things that seemed to match up, such as the likelihood of Mary being taken to North Carolina and her signing gasoline receipts along the way. And Mason, who John said had no financial stability, going on to purchase and operate a number of gas stations after Mary's disappearance. John's investigative team, well, they supposed that money, it had to come from somewhere. So maybe there was more truth to Stargell's confession than previously thought. Perhaps he was only telling parts of the truth. Perhaps he didn't want to directly involve himself as deeply as he might have been. It could be that he did have knowledge of a burial site, but it wasn't in Atlanta. Maybe it was in North Carolina. John said that gaining access to FBI files marked a turning point for his team, both in reconsidering Stargell's confession and in identifying new areas to search. What Gerald Mason did with his life after Mary's disappearance is key. When John's team began tracing Mason's life in the years following 1965, that money, it remained a sticking point.
He settled down and became a businessman. And here's the $64,000 question is he at one point owned 6 gas stations, did very well from a business standpoint, was a model citizen, didn't bother anybody. But where did he get the money? A convict, a rapist, a murderer, a vagabond who didn't own a car. Where did he get the money to buy gas stations? That's the question. If I can answer that question, I'll know immediately.
And this, as John put it, the smoking gun is the $5,000 that Mason received somehow, some way. He received $5,000 to be able to buy his first gas station, and which put him on into a completely different world than he had ever been in. He became a model citizen, as John said, and even when they slapped the cuffs on him, his daughter gave a report that, my father was a model father. He was the best father I could have ever had. But that is where all of this pretty much lies, in that if we can get our hands on that 19-page report, which we have not been able to do, changes the narrative completely in this investigation.
That's the question. Where is that confession? I'm pretty good. I've been doing this for 10 years, and I did it for a long time before. And in my world before, when I was in technology, I can find things. I can find people, and I'm not shy. I will call anybody and ask for help, and 99% of the time they help you. I can't find it. I can't find it anywhere.
John explained that his current investigation into Mason involves requesting assistance from the South Carolina Secretary of State to trace the corporations that Mason owned and determine the source of his funding. And he's also working with the assistant district attorney who prosecuted Mason, seeking information about Mason's activities from 1955 until his arrest. John acknowledged that he may be wrong about Mason's involvement, but he believes that this line of inquiry could finally provide answers to long-standing questions about Gerald Mason's mysterious transformation from career criminal to businessman. I asked John and Steve why Stargell's confession might have been so discounted by some over the years.
There's a lot of unanswered questions, but the general consensus that I have read is that the more they talked to him, the more his story changed, the more this would change. And they finally said, we're wasting our time. We're not getting anywhere. That's the impression I got. And one other thing, and Steve and I have talked about this 100 times, is that a lead comes in, process is open. They go find somebody, they go question somebody, and then it stops. No follow-up, no additional incident report, blah, blah, blah. There was a lot of that. May have just been sloppy record keeping, may have things been lost over 60 years, but there just seemed to be an awful lot of, oh, well, this didn't look too great. It just may have been the style of reporting and the style that they kept their records. I don't know. We haven't figured that out yet.
In terms of your documentary, walk me through your systematic methodology for approaching this 60-year-old case. How does the documentary show viewers the investigative process for starting so far back and beginning to work your way forward with the limitations at hand?
If you have evidence, if you have reports, if you have witnesses, you handle that exactly the same as if it were an armed robbery 6 hours ago. You gather everything that you can. You let the evidence tell you where to go. You let the evidence take you down this road. You let the evidence go find this person. It's the working of the evidence. It's exactly the same. The bad news is that evidence is lost. Evidence is cold. Evidence has been destroyed. Evidence has been thrown away.
Steve said, though, that tracking down retired agents and law enforcement and their families was key. When they located a second retired member of law enforcement who had files, they were able to build out even more of the story, even without the actual confession that they've been looking for.
And the main thing that we were able to gain from it was that in that paperwork that we had, the allusion to Stargell and the allusion to Mason were only mentioned. They were not actually portrayed as the perpetrators. And that made it where, for a very long time, John and I actually looked with a completely different set of eyes. We looked at so many different people so that it took us down a rabbit trail. Then finally, John was able to come up with the scenario between Stargell and Mason.
We know that physical evidence was lost. We know documents were lost. And we know that perhaps even what was reported in the media may not have been the most accurate representation of what occurred. So with that in mind, how did your team reconstruct the timeline and events of this case? And how does the documentary show this process?
It's the classic, all you can read, all you can work with is what is left. So then you go back, and if the only thing you can do is look at and they're pretty good photographs. Crime scene photographs, APD crime people and the state crime lab people took photographs of her car, a lot of them. And something has been bothering me for years. The groceries I keep hearing were on the floorboard. They're on the seat. So why would anybody move the groceries that she picked up and left in her car when she went shopping? That's something. But all we have right now is a little bit of videotape that is, well, 60 something years old, some reports that are left that we can find. They weren't destroyed. They were just mismatched or whatever, and photographs. And we found a few detectives, FBI people of that era. God bless them. They're in their 80s, but they still remember this. And you ask them, just talk about the case. Talk about what you remember. Talk about where you guys went on Friday nights for a beer. Just tell me about the era. Tell me about the cars that you drove. You just try to get a feel for every shred. You have no idea what is important. You just try to gather any information any way you can. And like I said, again, reports, photographs, and eyewitness, which is pretty damn slim right now.
However, I will add that the actual interviews that the FBI had, and the ones that we were able to get, and the ones that we read from beginning to end, those set up a particular timeline. And John was able to give that information to our filmmaker, Bill Vanderkloot. And what Bill was able to do was take those incidents and those reports that John and I both read, and he was able to take that information from John, and he built the timeline of Mary from the very beginning, the very night that it happened, all the way through basically to the Raleigh area where she was last seen. After that, it becomes very speculative about, people calling in and saying we saw Mary here or whatever when it didn't actually happen.
Considering that Mason and Stargell are a main focal point of the investigation that John and Steve's team are doing, and that the key piece of information they need, the confession, is not currently in their hands, I asked them to explain how they're pursuing those leads. John said he'd begun by dismissing the whole thing, but had shifted his perspective after examining some of the facts that just lined up. As mentioned earlier on, one point that their team is interested in is expanding the search for Mary in North Carolina. It's something, John says, that other investigators have also looked into, and mostly in their own time. John told us about previous independent investigation efforts, including the work of retired APD detective Ray Pate.
One more person that was a part of this, a retired APD detective, Ray Pate. Very nice man. He was not a homicide detective, but he was a sex crime detective, but he was obsessed with Mary Shotwell Little and the possible connection to Diane Shields. He went after it and after it, and it was his contention that Stargell's confession made sense, and he had his caretaker, the gentleman that worked for him part-time, drove him to North Carolina, I believe 3 times. There was a house there, house was gone. The house did have a wraparound porch, as Stargell talks about. There was a great big rock, front yard, backyard somewhere, and they found the dirt road. He's deceased now, but makes a very strong case that Mary Shotwell Little and Stargell all are connected and that Mary is buried somewhere around that property. Can we get aerial photos? Can we get satellite stuff? And that's when I'll go back to North Carolina virtually and talk to the North Carolina State Police, to the county sheriff, to the city police, and say, guys, we think this is where it is, and will you work it?
What do you hope that viewers will take away from watching the documentary? And aside from new leads and tips, which are the most important, are there any other specific actions that you're hoping it will inspire?
Yes. We're hoping that the overall documentary will develop interest not just in what happened to Mary, but also that it will lend a lot of credibility going into the documentary based on Diane Shields, the lady that shared a common desk with Mary at CNS Bank.
And as we've said, though Diane and Mary didn't work at the bank at the same time, they shared the same space. After all, Diane was Mary's replacement. And John and Steve have been collaborating with a relative of Diane's. Through that work, they've noted both similarities and differences in the cases. Mary was never found, and Diane's body was discovered in the East Point area of Metro Atlanta not so long after her disappearance. Her 1967 homicide remains unsolved, and there is debate over whether the cases are connected. There seem to have been similar occurrences in their lives leading up to their disappearances and their presumed or proven deaths. There's long been some speculation that Diane Shields might have been working undercover for the Atlanta Police Department, but John says he does not think that was the case. There are reports, he said, that Diane showed Jack Perry's business card to a few people, but giving out business cards to potential witnesses was standard practice for police. It still is. Considering that Diane took over Mary's job and even had some of the same roommates, he considers Jack speaking with Diane to be standard practice and not a sign of covert police investigation.
When you're talking to somebody, if you hear anything, if you know of anything, or if you have any thoughts, I don't care if it's 4 o'clock in the morning, if something hits you, you remember, here's my card, please call me.
Another story that's gone around connecting the two women was that they both received roses at work. And to our knowledge, the sender of Mary's flowers was never publicly identified. But John says he's heard a pretty consistent story regarding Diane's flowers, one that dismisses that parallel as part of the mystery. He says that he's not seen the actual report, but this is what he's told us he's gleaned from retired law enforcement.
I believe, and I'm almost positive, hers came from a babysitting job. The mom or the dad or both thought she did such a great job and she was so good with the kids and that they sent her flowers. That I've heard 50 times.
On the surface, the details do seem to connect them. But others argue that the careful planning that seems to have gone into Mary's disappearance is not present in Diane's homicide. John and Steve believe there is likely a connection, though, and they plan to investigate it further.
One thing you mentioned was your next documentary project, and I know that you have connected with a really involved and passionate relative of Diane Shields. What do you hope to do for Diane's case?
We have the best chance, in my opinion, of solving that case over Mary's because there's never been a body found. But there is still some unsolved work that can be done to find out who actually killed Diane. We have interviewed several people of note that are still living. And obviously we can't mention those names, but these people are still living, and there's a lot of real truth into the possibility that they were involved.
I spoke to somebody very well connected, not a detective, but smart guy, very smart guy. And the very first time we spoke 9 years ago, first thing out of his mouth is he says, you got to be pretty damn naive to think 2 young girls about the same age, worked at the same desk, worked at the same bank, had the same roommates, and were killed 17 months apart. Cold cases, granted, the perpetrator, the manner of death, completely opposite ends of the spectrum. But he said, you got to be pretty damn naive to believe, no, they're not connected.
There are no coincidences at all. This was totally related.
There is a connection, and I believe it's something to do with the bank. And one other real quick answer for that is, if they're not connected, what the hell was going on in Atlanta?
The hope of the team is to reignite interest in both women's unsolved cases and to generate new leads. In a 60-year-old case, old records and uncovered archives are invaluable, and finding out just where those items may be could mean resolution for Mary Shotwell Little and for Diane Shields. The documentary is the team's first public step in pursuing that, but they say it's not their last. If you have any information regarding the disappearance of Mary Shotwell Little or the murder of Diane Shields, please contact the Atlanta Police Department Criminal Investigations Division at 404-546-4236. You can also contact Atlanta CrimeStoppers anonymously at 404-577-TIPS or 8477. The new documentary, The Vanishing, the 60-year-old unsolved disappearance of Mary Shotwell Little, had a limited premiere in November 2025. There's a link to the documentary website in our show notes where you can learn more. To hear Jessica Knoll's incredible coverage of this case, you can find a link in our show notes to her series as well, and links to her articles on our website. She also provided voiceover for the documentary. We'll be back in January with our mid-season episodes, and February, season 25 begins. If you know of a case that should be covered on the Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is an independent podcast, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIA, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. Our therapy fund is paid for through Patreon and Apple Premium subscriptions. If you try out the products we advertise, please use our sponsor codes. It really helps. And please take a moment to rate and review our show in your podcast app of choice. We normally tell you to make sure that if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, to check that you're subscribed and that you're set for automatic downloads. But we want you all to do that over the next month because we will be switching platform providers. So you don't want to lose track of the podcast. My book, Lay Them to Rest, is out everywhere now. Find out more through the link in our show notes. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laura Norton. Interviews by Brooke Hargrove. Engineered and scored by Southern Gothic Media and Rachel Boyd. Content advisement by Vic Kennedy and Brandy C. Williams. Special thanks to Liz Lipka.